Go Long by Hazel Witch. Read by Kaiinbed. Chapter 11. The Whole 9 Yards. Content warning. A reminder that this fic depicts 17-year-old characters and includes consensual explicit scenes. Please click away if that's gonna make you uncomfortable. The semester raced by in a blink of an eye, and before Izuku knew it, it was March. The first promise of spring brought with it a new kind of dread. College admissions became the talk of nearly every conversation. The UA hallways buzzing with names and news and rising expectations. Izuku could barely slip between classes without hearing mention of at least one prestigious institution, and every time, it set his blood pounding. It had been easy to forget the future for a few weeks, to put all anxiety aside while he basked in the novelty of spending time with friends and worrying less about schoolwork. But with constant reminders ringing in his ears, his nerves began to fray. Every time he heard the mailman's cheerful whistle, his stomach splattered to the floor in some kind of Pavlovian response, a surge of apprehension causing the breath to catch in his throat. Sure, there was an element of comfort in not knowing. If he didn't know, he couldn't be devastated. But at the same time, it definitely felt like a form of torture. And he couldn't help flying to the mailbox every morning just to check. Just to make sure. But so far, there had been nothing. No letter from Stanford. Don't worry, Izuku. I've heard it takes ages for admission departments to get on top of things, Ochako said one lunch, when he nibbled so hard at his thumb it began to bleed. I'm sure you'll find out soon. It was easy for her to say. She'd received an acceptance from her in-state college of choice weeks ago. Had even started planning how she was going to decorate her dorm room. In fact, everyone else seemed to be ahead of him in that regard. Todoroki had been offered a place at business school in Pennsylvania, despite threatening to take a gap year just to spite his dad. And Ida was headed to study engineering at a school in the south. Izuku known the day would come when they went their separate ways, but it always felt somewhat theoretical, a plot point far down the line. Now it was starkly real, and he was confronted with the bitter irony that despite only ever dreaming of change, when it actually came knocking at his door, he'd give his right arm for things to stay as they were. He didn't want them to be all split up, at opposite ends of the country, having new experiences, meeting new people, making new memories, without him. He'd only just found himself, found his place in this godforsaken town, or so it felt at least. It'd taken him nearly 18 years, and now the proverbial rug was being pulled too soon. Plus, there was the issue of Katsuki. Izuku didn't even want to think about that. Sighing and dragging his feet up the stairs at the end of a long day, he tried to put it all out of mind. It was supposed to be an exciting time. Why did he always end up overthinking and conflicted? The sky outside the window of his room was dark, his furniture silhouetted against the soft amber glow of a streetlight. He flicked on a lamp and swung his backpack to the floor, slumping onto the bed. He sat for a few minutes, letting his mind drift, legs dangling over the side. What would you do? He said at last, gazing up at the All Might poster on the opposite wall. The gallant face remained staunchly quiet, white teeth set in a smile. All Might had never actually answered him in all these years. Izuku was going to have to fend for himself. Sighing again, his attention was called by the sudden illumination of the window across the alley. A familiar figure appeared, shifting around the room, all agile athleticism, even though he was probably only putting laundry away. The thought made Izuku smile, the knot in his stomach easing some. He let his feet drop to the floor, hauling deadweight limbs from the bedspread and padding to the window. He looked over into Katsuki's room, watching as he closed the closet door, head nodding softly along to whatever was playing through his earphones. Izuku had noticed there was a particular faded t-shirt he seemed to wear in the evenings. Perhaps once black, now muted to gray, a skull in the center. It suited him. Okay, yeah, everything suited him. He was freaking hot as a model, and Izuku's brain still shut off every time he saw him shirtless, but whatever. Izuku's movement must have caught his eye, because Kachan turned towards the window, mouth soft for a second before curled up at one side. He walked over, grabbing a notepad from his desk, before resting a shoulder against the frame and scribbling something down. He held it up, and Izuku felt the rush of fond nostalgia course through him when he considered how far they'd come the first time they'd done this. "Check your damn phone." Oh, it was still in his backpack, abandoned in favor of moping. Izuku turned and scurried over to find it, flicking on the screen and looking down at the notification. KB, 7:36 p.m. "My dad's away this weekend. Come over Friday. I'll cook." There was a crash and a curse from somewhere inside the house when Izuku rang the Bakugo's doorbell on Friday night, followed by a yelled, "Hang on a damn minute." It gave Izuku the chance to check his reflection in the glass, to ruffle his hair slightly and wonder if he made the right outfit choice. He'd never really given much thought to what he wore, always opting for comfort over any attempt at style. But he did want to look good tonight. In the end, he settled for the same black jeans he'd worn to Kirishima's party, the breeze now gusting through ribbed knees to cool his legs, and an old soft sweater of forest green that he hoped brought out his eyes. It took several minutes before heavy footsteps sounded from behind the door, and when it finally swung open, Katsuki's eyes bugged for a second. "Hi," Izuku said on a sharp inhale. His host had a dishcloth slung over one arm, a spatula brandished in one hand like a weapon, the sculpted rise of his shoulders and biceps very much visible in a black tank. Oh god, he looked handsome as hell. Katsuki coughed. "Oi, get in. It's fucking cold out there." Izuku did as he was told, trundling after Katsuki when he turned and headed back down the hallway towards the kitchen. The air was humid with the warming scent of meat and spice, something savory and delicious that made Izuku begin to salivate. He wasn't too bad at throwing together a meal himself when required. He'd learned a thing or two from his shift at the cafe over the years, but it was mostly comfort food, nothing elaborate, nothing like Katsuki was cooking, judging by the smell of it. "That smells amazing, Kachan," Izuku said in admiration, bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet. "What are you making?" "Mapo tofu," Katsuki replied with his back turned, busy shuffling a saucepan with practiced movements. "Hope you can handle a bit of spice." Izuku grinned as he watched Katsuki's expert hands at work. "I can handle you, can't I?" The muscles in his back tensed for a second, before easing, blonde head shaking with a tisk. Izuku had noticed these little giveaways more and more recently. The evidence that as much as he put on a front of bravado, certain things broke Katsuki's facade and ruffled his feathers for a second or two. Mostly when Izuku shot back a quip, or danced too close to saying something heartfelt. "You've turned into a confident little shit, you know," Katsuki grumbled, as he began heaping rice and the minced beef mixture onto 2 plates. Izuku accepted one happily when it was handed to him. "I wonder who I get it from," he said, intentionally acting coy to see if he could elicit more uncharacteristic jitteriness. But this time Katsuki only huffed and shook his head again, gesturing for them both to take a seat at the small round table in the corner of the room. Izuku noted that it was carefully laid with placemats and matching sets of cutlery as he slid into the chair. The food was delicious, as expected, and the warning of spice warranted. Izuku felt heat buzz at his lips and tongue with every additional bite, mouth tingling as he ate. "This is so good, Kachan," he said, closing his eyes to savor it. "You're a great cook." Katsuki only rolled his eyes and spoke as he chewed. "Cooking is just about paying attention and following a set of rules, Deku. There's nothing to swoon over." Leaning back in his seat, one arm slung over the back, he regarded Izuku with those ever-sharp eyes. "So," he said between mouthfuls, "nothing from Stanford yet, right?" Izuku shook his head and swallowed. "Not yet. Everyone keeps telling me it'll be fine, and that something will come soon, and I hope so. I'm trying to stay positive." Brows bunching slightly as he took another bite, Katsuki pointed his fork at Izuku in a way that would seem threatening to anyone that didn't know him well. "You don't need to stay positive, Deku," he said. "It's gonna happen. I got a feeling about these things, and I'm never wrong." Izuku smiled weakly and looked down, nudging the contents of his plate from one side to the other. Hearing Katsuki sound so certain, So unwaveringly sure that he'd be admitted was nice, reassuring. But it would also make things 10 times more embarrassing if he ended up being rejected. Katsuki aimed a narrow look at him, trying to find his way into Izuku's gaze as he shuffled another spoonful of rice into his mouth. Man, he really did eat like a machine. Guess it made sense as a means of maintaining his physique. Plus, you gotta be thinking about medicine, surely, he said, jabbing towards Izuku with the fork again to emphasize his point. After that whole scene at the bowling alley, you're natural. Izuku swallowed. I guess. It's made me think about things, sure. I'm considering it. Maybe. He was still hesitant to say much more. Whatever dream or ambition was beginning to take shape in his mind was hazy and unformed, and he didn't want to share it with anyone else just yet. Not even Kachan. Realizing he'd paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, Izuku looked up and met Katsuki's eye. But what about you? He asked, keen to divert attention elsewhere. Have you heard anything from any colleges yet? This time it was Katsuki that looked away, flitting his eyes down to an almost empty plate and studying it intently. Nah, he said after a pause. Not yet. Then he scraped his chair back so suddenly it made Izuku startle, standing and heading over to the stove to serve himself a second helping of food. I'm not worried, he continued, resolutely staring down as he piled rice and steaming mapo tofu into a mountain. I'll get an offer. They'd all have to be damn stupid not to say I'm the best. Izuku was inclined to agree, but he also wasn't sure scouting necessarily worked that way. Wasn't sure how much it went down to pure observation of skill versus luck and connections. There had been that awful game at the end of the season, but he hoped for Katsuki's sake that he was right. Hopefully you'll hear soon too. There was a clatter as Katsuki returned the lid to the saucepan and slid back into his seat, setting the plate down. Izuku took another forkful and chewed. They ate in silence for a few minutes, Katsuki working his way steadfastly through his second portion like he was powering through a set of repetitions at the gym. When he placed his fork down at an angle on the scrape-clean plate, he leaned back in his chair again and gave Izuku a once-over. Do you remember? He said, voice coming out husky and low, the timbre of it practically rumbling through Izuku's core. When we first met, you asked me about the other things in life. Things other than football. Like, I don't know, friends? Izuku could easily pluck the conversation from his memory. The image of the two of them talking in this very room, fixing his bloody nose. Girlfriend, maybe? Yeah, I remember. And I said something like, as if I've got time for any fucking extras. Izuku finished for him, smiling slightly at the way things had turned out. Right. He lifted an arm and raked a hand messily through his hair, fingers clenching into blonde spikes before slapping back down to his thigh. He cleared his throat. Well, just for fucking once. I think I was wrong about that. The smile on Izuku's face faltered, absorbing the words that coursed through his veins like hot liquid and pumped directly into his heart. Don't get it twisted, Katsuki added quickly, evading Izuku's gaze to look over at the refrigerator. His Adam's apple bobbed before he spoke again, more softly this time. Football is a big fucking deal, sure. It's like my path in life or whatever, and I'm not gonna think about what I would be without it. But this year, he turned and those searing eyes sought out Izuku's wide ones once more. I guess I've realized there are other things just as important outside of that. Things I need to hold on to. Things like you. Izuku froze, eyes wide. Katsuki's face was the picture of sincerity, the words spoken so firm and true that Izuku's eyes began to well, a fluttering starting in his chest. There was a long pause as he struggled to make the right connections in his brain to make his mouth move so that words could actually come out of it. Oh! How was he expected to remember how to speak when Katsuki had basically just compared him to the most important thing in his life? Izuku's brain had completely blown a fuse. On the other side of the table, Katsuki's expression tightened, moving from expectant to surly as the seconds ticked by. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the same way it did just before he was about to take a test at school. Izuku tried again, fumbling for words that caught on his tongue, trying to think of the right way to express the swell of emotions suddenly tumbling around his brain and body like 1,000 tiny sparks. Kachan, Crossing his arms over his chest, Katsuki's voice came out flat. Alright, don't have an embolism, he said. Thought you liked all that sappy shit. Cursing his stupid mouth, Izuku sprung to his feet. I do, he said, sending his chair back with a loud scrape that made Katsuki scowl harder. I do like it. He edged around the table, knees wobbling slightly, using the opportunity to take a deep breath and get himself together as he moved to stand right next to where Katsuki had slouched further in his chair. I'm sorry, he said, reaching out to lay the palm of his hand against the carved cheek, feeling the warm flush that had risen over it. I was just taken aback. He stroked the thumb over a sharp cheekbone, tracing the line of it right up to Katsuki's hairline. When he spoke again, it sounded thick, a bubble in his throat. Kachan, I feel the same. Katsuki didn't turn, clearly offended by Izuku's lack of immediate response, but the clench of his arms eased slightly. You mean a lot to me. The crease between Katsuki's brow softened, but didn't fully smooth over, and he still didn't turn his head. I should fucking hope so, he grunted after what felt like a very long time, arms relaxing a touch more. Izuku dropped his hand from Katsuki's face to rest on the exposed skin of his shoulder. Of course you mean a lot to me, he said, voice warm with all the shared moments, all the longing and the pining, and then finally, everything that had come after it. You're Kachan. You're amazing. You're smart and strong and talented. You're the best football player I've ever seen, and you're a great cook too. He gestured to the table, their empty plates. Katsuki rolled his eyes, but his mouth curled slightly, just for a fraction of a second. Izuku went on. And we have a lot in common, more than I ever would have thought. I know you know all the words to the One for All theme tune, even though you pretend you don't. Katsuki huffed in a semi-protest, but Izuku wasn't finished. And you care about your friends. You can't fool me, I know that you do. And most of all, for some reason, you care about me, and that's really... Okay, Freckles, I get it. With a begrudging sigh, like he was doing him a favor, Katsuki released his arms and hopped his chair to the side so he was facing Izuku properly. He shook his head and reached up to flick him on the forehead. I already know I'm the fucking best. Izuku smiled down at him. Well, that makes two of us. The next shake of Katsuki's head was just a little exasperated, but he parted his knees so that Izuku could settle between them. Thank you for dinner, Izuku murmured, trailing a finger in circles over Katsuki's skin and delighting when he saw goosebumps forming beneath his touch. Raising a brow, Katsuki tilted his chin back. Not the only thanks I get, pointedly letting his eyes drop and then linger at Izuku's mouth. God, he was so effortlessly sexy, the rasp of his voice like a drug that forever had Izuku dizzy and breathless. His thoughts were still rarely clear when in Katsuki Bakugo's presence. Was that normal? Even after all these months? Deciding not to think about it, Izuku just smiled again and leaned in, brushing their lips together, soft and sweet. He hummed slightly into the kiss before pulling away, keeping his eyes shut with dopey joy. When he opened them, Katsuki was staring at him, an intensity to his gaze that hadn't been there before. Hooking fingers through Izuku's belt loops, he snapped his hips forward until Izuku was nestled right up against the chair. That fucking noise, he rumbled. Izuku close enough to count every golden eyelash, every fleck of russet in those serious eyes. I swear to God, you do that on purpose. There was another twitch of Katsuki's jaw before he yanked Izuku in and kissed him again, this time more deeply, a series of zings and pops dancing down his spine as their lips worked together. Amidst all the sensations it set off in his body, all the fireworks, Izuku became aware of large hands skimming around his hips and descending, gripping, running up and down the backs of his thighs, and sending more jolts of electricity across his skin whenever they skimmed close to the curve of his ass. The movement was like an iron poker to hot coals, stoking a fire that sent flames soaring towards the sky. Katsuki's head tilted to the side, lips parting, and the first assertive sweep of tongue made Izuku groan. Fuck. Katsuki muttered in the pause they took to catch their breath. You're trying to murder me tonight. Izuku smiled against his lips. If anything, a much different intention was rising in him, a sense of want and need that had only grown stronger as the weeks went on. He wanted them to be closer than they'd ever been before. Kachan, he whispered as Katsuki shifted to slot their mouths together from a different angle, letting himself melt for a moment, right down to the bones so that all the deepest parts of him were exposed. Then, when they broke apart, he whispered again, Take me upstairs. A noise slipped from Katsuki's throat, guttural with desire, almost animal, as he stood so quickly he almost knocked Izuku off balance. Fuck, yeah, okay. With hands anchored to Izuku's hips, he kissed hard and deep, only pausing for a quick stoop and grunt as he hefted Izuku up by the backs of his thighs into his arms, barely giving him time to part his legs and link them around Katsuki's back before they were kissing again. Swaying slightly with each step, Katsuki started off through the door, down the hall, stumbling semi-blind between kisses so they bounced against the wall a few times. Shit, he said when they reached the stairs, voice hoarse and sandpaper rough. I forgot about those. Izuku laughed into his cheek, so giddy he could practically feel the joy radiating from every pore. It's fine, he said, unhooking his legs and slithering to the floor, summoning seduction from a place inside him he didn't know existed. I can lead the way. Coiling a hand into the front of Katsuki's tank, he tugged, walking backwards up the stairs and biting down on his lip. Katsuki blinked slow, mouth open, dumb looking for a second. Jesus Christ, he rasped, eyes transfixed. What the fuck have you done with Deku? Izuku laughed again and led them up to the landing and along, passing several closed doors until they reached Katsuki's bedroom. Hands everywhere, eyes everywhere, lips stealing more contact whenever they got the chance. He turned and Katsuki practically scooped them up, walking Izuku backwards until the crook of his knees met the bed. Hang on, Izuku mumbled, pushing back against the hefty weight of Katsuki's frame. Slipping beneath his arm and spinning until their positions were reversed. A look of surprise quickly softened to assent, something flitting across Katsuki's eyes before he nodded and sat on the bed, shuffling backwards. Izuku took the opportunity to pull his sweater over his head, hair frizzing with static electricity as he let it drop to the otherwise pristine floor. Katsuki already shimmying out of his pants and reaching back to haul off his shirt. In seconds, he was lying in wait, chest heaving, maybe the slightest shimmer of sweat over his pecs from the frenetic pace they'd set so far. Izuku stripped off his shirt and pants too, buzzing with energy, easing a knee down on the bed, and crawling over Katsuki's body, finding a seat atop it. Deku, Katsuki said, so softly Izuku almost missed it. Hands reaching up to find his waist, his hips. They paused to stare at each other for a second, an unspoken agreement passing in the air between them. This time, there was no stuttered question from either of them as to whether the other was sure. The fierce certainty of their shared gaze when their eyes met was enough. They both wanted this. Have you got stuff? Izuku asked, rocking his hips gently back and forth, watching Katsuki's face twist at the motion, mouth dropping open before he swallowed and gathered himself enough to croak out a response. Bedside table. Good. That meant he'd been thinking about this too. Izuku, for his part, had spent ample time over the past few months preparing himself in the darkness of his bedroom, wanting to be ready when the occasion presented itself. Now he nodded and reached over, Katsuki's hand sliding up his sides as he rummaged. The bottle of lube and a box of condoms were easy to find, placed on top of a pair of plaid pajamas, laid out neatly and close to hand. We need to, prep me, Izuku said, face heating as he spoke. Katsuki had gone red too, but he nodded and moved a hand over the front of Izuku's boxers, rubbing at the outline of his cock. It worked to relax him. Izuku's shoulders going slack as Katsuki cupped and palmed him, shooting him through with warm, easy pleasure that fuzzed the corner of his vision. He hummed, tilting his chin to the ceiling and closing his eyes, enjoying the touch that had become so easy as they learned each other's bodies. When he looked back down, it was to find Katsuki watching him, brows tilted up in the middle, eyes wide, face open, exposed. "I'm gonna take these off," Izuku whispered, slipping thumbs beneath the waistband of his boxers and tugging them down, awkwardly maneuvering himself from one knee to the other, shifting to get them over his legs without leaving Kachan's lap. It was another effort to get Katsuki's off in turn, a clumsy shuffle of hands and fabric that had Izuku laughing slightly at their failed attempt to stay smooth while getting naked, meeting Katsuki's eye and grinning wider when he huffed out a laugh too. Eventually, they were successful, and Katsuki's face flickered with that soft look once more, eyes traveling over Izuku's body and lingering at the point where he straddled Katsuki's bare thighs. The line of his gaze was penetrating, leaving Izuku feeling stripped bare, seen, maybe even revered for a second or two. It had him welling up, overcome with a wave of emotion, bending down and pouring the entirety of his being into a slow, passionate kiss. "I want you," he murmured in the space between their lips. "I want to feel you." Fuck. Apparently rendered otherwise speechless, the single curse was all Katsuki managed before his hand was scrabbling across the sheets for the lube, flicking open the cap one-handed. Izuku sat up slightly to give him room to squeeze out some of the gel, gasping when cool, slender fingers reached around his back and stroked down the seam of his ass, once, twice, caressing the most intimate part of him. "You ready?" Katsuki asked, and Izuku whispered out a breathless, "Yes," focusing on relaxing every muscle in his body. The first gentle press and push was easier than he'd imagined, a sigh slipping from his lips as Katsuki rose up to kiss him through it. Long, tender strokes of that deft hand moved in and out, giving him time to get used to it, careful and delicate. The second digit was surprisingly fine, too. And when Katsuki crooked his fingers and brushed at that sweet spot Izuku had first discovered in the depths of the night, he couldn't help but let out a long hiss of pleasure. "You okay?" Katsuki's voice cracked. "Yeah." Izuku cupped his face and pressed their foreheads together. "That feels good." Relief washed over Katsuki's features, and he began stroking anew, reaching again for the place that made Izuku gasp. It felt good, nice. The two of them pressed chest to chest, sharing this moment, this experience for the first time. Soon, Katsuki was rubbing an extra finger against his rim in silent suggestion, and Izuku knelt up to give him a better angle. This time, the extra stretch came with a hint of a burn, but Katsuki was so slow, so gentle, eyes flitting over Izuku's face and watching for any sign of discomfort. It passed with little resistance, heat giving way to a warmth that sent tingles down his thighs. Sitting up properly, Izuku tested his ability to move, to bounce, to fuck himself up and down on Katsuki's fingers, while their eye contact burned intense between them. Fuck, you look so... In this position, Izuku felt fearless and unashamed, sexy, looking down at Katsuki's face to see wonder and rapture all wound up in a scrunch of his brows. His free hand lifted from its grip on Izuku's hip to skim a thumb over his nipple, and oh, there was a jolt of pleasure that shot straight to his cock, making it twitch. That was a new discovery. A few more rises and falls, and then Izuku was keen for more. "I think I'm ready, Kachan," he said on a shaky breath, and heard Katsuki audibly gulp, slowing the movement of his hand. "Shit, okay, give me a minute." Izuku hadn't expected Katsuki to be the one to need a pause, but he was happy to wait, happy to let Katsuki's hand drop from his nipple to his cock and pump a few times until Izuku's head dropped back again with a moan. "Okay," Katsuki repeated, this time sounding more like himself. "Okay." He removed both of his hands, and Izuku shuddered at the sudden emptiness, shuffling back slightly and waiting as Katsuki ripped open the condom wrapper and rolled it over himself, biting at his lip with concentration, as he slicked his cock with a healthy amount of lube. When he was satisfied, he looked up, tongue slipping over his lips as he reached out for Izuku's hips again. "You gotta tell me if it hurts," he said, low and heavy with a sense of duty. I don't wanna hurt you." "You won't." Izuku hushed, saying it as much for himself as for Kacchan, as he edged forward and rose on his knees, a sudden stirring of nervous butterflies awakening in his stomach. "I'm going to take it slow." Forcing relaxation in his muscles again, he took Katsuki's cock in hand and guided it towards his entrance, nudging it gently, carefully, sinking down gradually. The burn was more pronounced, as was the stretch, but it was okay. He could take it. It was Katsuki, and he wanted to feel every second of it, every inch of him. I wanted this for so long. Fucking hell. Katsuki looked totally gone by the time Izuku had breathed in and out a few times, and then taken him all the way in. Fingers on one hand gripping the meat of Izuku's thigh, like it was his only tether to earth, the other clenched in the sheets. Settling, Izuku closed his eyes, letting himself get used to the sensation, waiting for any pain to sleep away before he spoke again. I'm gonna move now. And he did. Began the steady rhythmic roll and drop of his hips, still slow, still careful, glad to be the one in control, the one to set the pace. The same feeling of serenity he always seemed to experience when they got intimate washed over him, focusing only on just how full he felt, stretched every time he sank down on Katsuki's dick, any excess tension draining right out of him. There was a warmth to it, the drag as he lifted up, and then the delicious slide back into place, the occasional twinge when he found a good angle and chased it down. His breath caught in his chest as he shifted backwards slightly, resting hands on Katsuki's thighs until his cock rubbed up inside him in just the right way, drawing a gasp from between his lips and almost making his eyes roll back in his head. Oh God, Kacchan. It feels good. Propriety hands moved from his hips to his torso, roaming over every inch of skin. Kacchan watching him in awe as Izuku rode him with an adeptness that came as a surprise to the both of them. Deku, fuck. Jesus Christ. Katsuki's words had become short and sharp, barely more than harsh pants and curses. Face misted over and fingers hot as they wrapped around Izuku's steadily bouncing cock. The combination was almost too much. The feel of Katsuki inside of him, full and thick and oh so real in a way none of the discreetly ordered toys he'd been dabbling with could match, plus the hurried flick of his wrist as he stroked Izuku's dick. Izuku could feel it rising, building inside him, the finish line racing into view all too soon. Kacchan, I'm close, he gasped out, hands slipping slightly on Katsuki's legs, where they'd both started to sweat. I'm sorry. The responding rumble of displeasure, as Katsuki folded up to a sitting position, thrummed through Izuku's skin. Don't fucking apologize, he murmured, hands still tight and working over Izuku's dick, the other skimming down the length of his spine and cupping under his ass to assist with the increasingly frantic rhythm. Never apologize for feeling good, Deku, for taking what you want. I fucking want you to. I want to know what it feels like. Almost chest to chest, the heat between them was stifling. Katsuki capturing Izuku's lips in a kiss that was hungry with tongue and teeth, as well as the shift of their bodies, in and out, over and over, hair damp and stuck to their foreheads, and palms clammy, and oh God, oh God, oh God. A swell of love and pleasure took over, so overwhelming and all-consuming. It burst its banks and flooded over Izuku until he gave into it completely, allowing himself to be carried away in its ebb and flow like driftwood in the current. Oh God, right there. The orgasm tore through him like he was nothing but a scrap of paper, whole body convulsing and shaking, hips running up into Katsuki's hands as he spilled all over their bare stomachs. Katsuki was faring no better, a look on his face that Izuku wanted to carve into stone so he could keep it forever. Eyes clenched shut, teeth gritted around a final groan as he came to. Fuck. Broad arms banded around Izuku's back, Katsuki jerking up in short, sharp thrusts, face diving against Izuku's shoulder, smearing lips over his collarbone. They clung to each other like that, shuddering aftershocks catching and shooting tremors down Izuku's thighs, taking a few seconds for their timing to slow, for Katsuki to uncurl his spine and look up with a glazed expression. No words felt like the right ones, so Izuku settled for brushing their noses quickly together as they breathed deep of the same air, linking arms around Katsuki's neck, lacing fingers into his hair. Wow, he eventually whispered, the two of them still tangled up in each other, both in body and in mind. I don't think first times are supposed to be that good. Katsuki snorted quietly, keeping his face close so that the exhale was warm on Izuku's skin. You're fucking surprised? Who the hell do you think we are? His voice was low, and had found its way back to its usual cocky inflection, but his eyes still carried a weighted quality to them. It's we now, is it? Izuku said with a smile, grazing his hands up and down Katsuki's nape. I get to be part of your megalomania by association. Katsuki made a tisk sound, but didn't shift Izuku from his lap, even though it was beginning to get uncomfortable. Izuku sensed they both needed the closeness. Thought I told you earlier, Katsuki muttered, squeezing the arm still looped tight around Izuku's torso, the throb of a pulse palpable against his lower back. You're getting too damn snarky. Sorry. Leaning in for a sweet kiss, Izuku let himself enjoy the high for just a little longer. Seriously though, he murmured when they broke apart. I really liked it. Forehead to forehead, Katsuki nodded. Me too. They savored the feel of bare skin on skin, of simple intimacy, waiting until the ickiness down below really became unbearable before beginning the sorry task of separating their bodies. Grimacing and propping himself up on his elbows, Katsuki gave Izuku the space to clamber off to one side, while he reached across to the well-stocked bedside table and produced tissues, passing over a handful. Izuku nibbled at his lip as he watched him tie off the condom. Stuffing it in a wad of tissues and sending it sailing across the room to the wastepaper basket. I'll put it in the trash later, Katsuki said when he turned and noticed Izuku's expression. Destroy all the evidence. Now stop worrying and come here. Okay. The twin bed, perfectly made when they'd entered the room, now considerably more rumpled, wasn't as narrow as Izuku's own, but it still wasn't designed for two. It meant that snuggling was a requirement, and Izuku was totally okay with that. He huddled into Katsuki's side, head pillowed on his chest, a strapping arm draped around his shoulders. They were quiet for a few minutes, Izuku listening to the steady ba-dump of Kachan's heartbeat in his ear. It was nice. I feel really safe with you, he whispered into the silence, warm and happy. His voice sounded distant, like it was high above the clouds, where his emotions still hovered. Then, after thinking about it for a second, he added, I wish I'd known you when I was younger. His head was lifted sharply, as Katsuki's chest swelled with air. You don't. I was a little shit. Izuku rolled his head so he could look up, chin digging into the flesh of a peck. I do, he protested. We could have been childhood friends. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Her fingers wove into Izuku's curls and scratched lazily at his scalp. It felt almost as good as the sex had. Childhood enemies, more like. I'd have pushed you in the mud for being so cute. You think I'm cute? I think you're annoying. The hand in Izuku's hair ruffled over his crown. Are you gonna let me enjoy some post-nap peace and quiet or what? Gross, Kachan. Izuku frowned, but he allowed Katsuki to roll him to one side so he could pull the covers back and tuck them both underneath. Nestled together in the only pocket of the world that mattered, they snoozed for an hour or so until a slice of pale-faced moon was visible through the window. It pained Izuku to stir, to peel himself away from Katsuki's hot house skin, but he knew it must be close to 10 o'clock, and the approach of his 11 p.m. curfew. He snuck a glance at his watch. 10:38. Crap. Later than he thought. I need to go, he said softly, saddened by the fact that he couldn't just lie awake all night and watch Katsuki's beautiful face as he slept. My mom will start to worry about me. Grunting low and deep somewhere in the back of his throat, Katsuki squeezed his eyes more tightly before cracking one open. He ran a hand up and down Izuku's back. Ugh, fine. With a sigh, he extracted his arm and stretched above his head, then sat up and swung heavy legs over the side of the bed. Izuku shuffled after him. An ache to his thighs making itself known as he stooped to retrieve his hastily discarded clothing. He'd be feeling that for the next few days, for sure. Katsuki saw him down to the door in a pair of old sweatpants alone, bare-chested and gorgeous as they stopped in the hall for a final kiss. "One day," he said as they pulled apart, leaning over to yank the door open behind Izuku with an unnecessary amount of force. "One day, I'll have you till morning." Heart buzzing like it was filled with a swarm of bees, Izuku nodded earnestly. "That's a promise," he said, going to his tiptoes to kiss Katsuki's cheek. "Thank you again for dinner." "Night, Freckles." "Good night." Reluctantly, Izuku turned and stepped out onto the porch, face instantly cooled by the breeze. Every step of the short distance home might as well have been paved with marshmallow. His knees felt so weak. What a night it had been. It took a whole new week, then another one after that, before it arrived. On the one day, Izuku didn't check the mailbox on his way to school, of course. Instead, it was waiting for him when he returned home, laid out on the table, crisp and ominous, the recognizable stamp of the redwood tree in one corner. The letter. The letter he'd been waiting for all freaking year. The letter that contained his future, after all the months of anticipation, was finally here.